it's my great pleasure to wish you a happy new year 2021 and to welcome you to the first research seminar this term, and of course for the start of the year 2021. Let me start by housekeeping issues. Please mute your microphone until you wish to speak. And also so that we don't have any echoes in the background. And of course, switch off your phone so that also if you are not unmuted, so that we don't have the echo in the background. Otherwise, it's a great pleasure, and I'm delighted to welcome two great speakers for today, but also to welcome a lot of distinguished colleagues from all over the world who have joined us in this seminar today. I can see a number of names here, ranging from Yusuf Somare from Laval in Canada, already here with us. George Okello from Makerere University. I can see Amidu from University of Ghana, Bojo from Sweden. I see also colleagues including Machiko Nisanke and Chris Adikok. Thank you all for being able to make it, and including many other people who have just joined. I can see whom I won't be able to mention all close to 100 people who are with us in this presentation. But we are specifically delighted today because we have our good colleagues, Professor Pasquale Scaramozzino from SOAS University of London, and also affiliated again some way to with the University of Rome Tor Vergata, jointly with a colleague, also Professor Leonardo Becchetti, who is from University of Rome Tor Vergata, but also is a professorial fellow here at School of Finance and Management at SOAS University of London. So this is more or less a very good effort of getting together SOAS University of London and University of Rome Tor Vergata. They are, both of them are distinguished in their own rights, having populated the literature for the last so many years with so many great provocative papers in top journals. But what is so interesting today, and what I would like to thank them for, is for them to actually focus their effort, their current effort, on some of the one of the big problems today, which is the COVID-19, and looking at COVID-19 in the context of debt, the debt question. So this much welcome. I know there are a number of people who are also working in this area, so I would hope for a very constructive engagement, discussion, and pointing to greater productivity that will extend beyond this simply the 2 hours we have for this seminar. Now, both the two colleagues, Pasquale and Leonardo, would like to do a two-person drama. I've kind of agreed. So we'll get them presenting first Pasquale and then Leonardo after. And please post your comments, observation, constructive engagement, anything great you can think of that would enhance the value to what we're discussing today into the chat room, or just simply indicate on the show of hands where you can click on, so we can note that actually your hand is up and you need to make a contribution. And if we can't put it within the presentation, we can organize it after the two speakers have presented. Then we will go into the cut and thrust of a question and answer, and get interactive engagement, and altogether heightening the debate on this important issue of the COVID-19 pandemic and global debt. Okay, So let me ask Pasquale to get the ball rolling. Pasquale.
Thank you very much, Victor, for your introduction, for inviting us to give this paper in the first instance. And I'd also like to thank Meng for organizing the seminar with her usual efficiency. So let me start by sharing the PowerPoint presentation. Yes, I hope you can now see the slide
Yes.
with the title. So we're going to address a topical issue, the possible measures to control and to control the consequences of the large increase in sovereign debt that have arisen in order to attempt to limit the economic consequences and economic fallout from the COVID pandemic. Now, the structure of the presentation, I will introduce the issue and give some general motivation, and then I will give some general perspectives on debt relief. And in particular, we shall put forward a number of proposals that could be implemented to relieve the burden of sovereign debt after the pandemic is over. Now, some of these proposals have already been suggested in the public debate and in the literature, and they tend to be discounted quite harshly. The European Central Bank itself has considered some of these proposals, but especially regarding that cancellation, and tends to, but their response was a very institutional one. And now we'll try and consider some possible implications of these proposals and examine their feasibility in the light of possible objections that could be raised. So I will give the first part of the presentation, then my colleague Leonardo will take over. So first, some grim statistics about the COVID pandemic. As of today, from data from the World Health Organization, overall in the world, there have been over 90 million confirmed cases and nearly 2 million deaths attributed to COVID-19. And Europe was hit very hard, nearly 30 million confirmed cases and over 600,000 deaths as of today. The economic impact of the pandemic has been very severe, of course. The IMF estimates that output in advanced economy is projected to fall by about 6.1% this year. Even emerging markets and developing countries are projected to have negative growth rates, on average 1.0% in 2020. If we exclude China, the fall would be greater, minus 2.2%. And globally, national governments committed nearly $12 trillion in fiscal actions and about $7.5 trillion in monetary action to counter the consequences of the pandemic. Now, this has resulted in large increases in fiscal deficits and also, of course, in debt GDP ratios. In particular, the debt GDP ratio in the European Union has increased by about 15 percentage points since the beginning of the pandemic. And of course, it raises some potential issues for the long-term sustainability of public debt. On average, aggregate public and private debt has increased to 365% of global GDP, according to the Institute of International Finance. So big debate is taking place about what to do with this debt. The experience from the financial crisis of 2007, 2008 is that austerity policies to try and consolidate public finances after a large increase in deficits and debt could have some negative and potentially counterproductive consequences, even on public finances themselves. And so there is issue whether we can avoid some of the negative consequences from debt consolidation after the pandemic is over. Now, some general perspectives on debt relief. There is a whole theoretical literature on debt restructuring, and particular debt forgiveness. An important paper, Krugman, argues that debt forgiveness can be preferable to debt financing, which could result from a restructuring of debt, because a large public debt would have the effect of distorting economic incentives in the debtor country, and the benefits from a positive economic performance would mostly be appropriated by the creditors. So there will be some important redistribution effects that would act in a perverse way. Some empirical studies have looked at the consequences and implications of increases in public debt after the financial crisis of 2007-2008. Braun and others find that the increase in public debt led to reallocation of credit away from the private sector and toward the public sector, with a consequent reduction in private investment and negative effects on growth. And Lowe and Rogoff, in another paper, confirmed that public and external debt overhang was an important determinant of the sluggish economic growth experienced by a number of countries after the financial crisis. Now, in an important paper, Reinhardt and Trebesch have considered a number of episodes of debt restructuring or default over two crucial periods of the 20th century. The first period was the interwar period in between the First and the Second World War, and these episodes mostly affected developed countries. They also consider a second set of episodes in the post-Second World War period, and the second episode mostly affected developing countries. Now, in the first interwar period, well, after the First World War, a number of countries benefited from some forms of debt relief. It could be debt restructuring or outright debt cancellation. And this included most countries in Western Europe, Austria, Belgium, France, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Italy, New Zealand, Portugal, and Romania, so on either side of the conflict. And notably, the United Kingdom itself agreed to restructure its war debt with the United States in 1923. And in 1934, it notified the US of its decision to defer war payments. Now, sometimes if you read the economic news media and the newspapers in the UK, you get the impression that the United Kingdom never defaulted on its debt, apart from historical periods during the Napoleonic Wars or so. But it's not actually true. There are episodes, even relatively recently, when the United Kingdom did default on its debt. And now the debt reliefs in Western countries after World War I were actually very substantial. During the 1930s, they amounted to about 21% of GDP, so they're quite massive. And Reinhardt and Trebesch show that debt relief generated positive effects on economic activity, on debt service, and even on the financial ratings of the countries involved. And these effects were stronger and more significant in the cases of outright debt cancellation or default, vis-à-vis softer forms of debt relief that involved some restructuring of debt. Now, it's important to know that in all of the debt relief episodes of the last century, analyzed by Reinhardt and Trebesch, and also the rest of the literature, the creditor was a sovereign country. Now, what makes the current situation different from past experience is that the government debt we are considering is held by central banks. So central banks hold debt issued by the sovereign, by the treasuries. Now, how do we get out of from a large debt? Well, typically you can reduce your debt ratio either by resorting to inflation, or by having the economy grow at a fast rate, or by some forms of debt restructuring or cancellation. Now, the official response, let's say, by the European Central Bank, is that the only way to resolve a situation of large debt is through growth. They would never endorse inflation. They are committed to maintaining stable prices, inflation not higher than 2%, and they would not consider outright debt cancellation or restructuring. But what we are trying to see in this paper is whether it is possible to put forward and to implement some forms of central bank intervention that could help reduce the debt crisis. Now, some proposals have already been presented and suggested in the past few years before the pandemic. And maybe the most influential one is the so-called PADRE plan, suggested by Perry and Whiploth. PADRE stands for Politically Acceptable Debt Restructuring in the Eurozone. Now, this is a quite radical plan that recommends that government debt of EU member states in excess of the 60% debt GDP threshold, indicated, for instance, the Maastricht Treaty, should be purchased and converted into non-redeemable zero-interest perpetual debt. Now, this operation creates a negative net asset position in the European Central Bank balance sheet, but this position will be progressively covered by seniorage revenues accruing to each member country. And in order to make the proposal politically acceptable, each country would pay its excess debt converted into ECB bonds with its seniorage revenues, okay, thereby avoiding redistributive effects across its members. Now, we consider a number of proposals that could, in principle, be considered and could reduce the debt overhang problem post-pandemic. Now, at present, the strategy of the ECB is to roll over a target share of government bonds and of returning the interest payments to the issuing countries. So this is the current strategy pursued by the ECB, and this strategy is voluntary and reversible. In our proposal, this strategy would become irreversible. And so this would be equivalent in its effects to a debt cancellation, and the portion of debt involved in the operation could effectively be cancelled from the debt GDP ratios. Now, this strategy would differ from the PADRE proposal because we don't consider all the stock of debt in excess of 60%, but in principle, this target share could be limited to the share of debt that can be attributed to the COVID crisis. The second proposal is that the bonds held by ECB are converted into irredeemable zero-interest bonds. And so this could be, again, considered the first step of the PADRE plan. And what would need to be done to complete the operation is to be transforming them into irredeemable bonds at zero interest rates. Now, this would effectively reduce the market value of these bonds to zero, but they do not affect the nominal value of these bonds. And the difference with the PADRE plan would be that it's less ambitious because it does not involve all debt in excess of the 60% debt GDP ratio. The third hypothesis, a third scenario, would be an outright write-off of a given portion of public bonds held by the European Central Bank. And this decision would have the consequence of creating a negative asset position in the European Central Bank consolidated balance sheet. And we shall examine the implications of this negative net asset position in our analysis. A fourth strategy could involve issuing perpetual bonds by member countries by an amount corresponding to the debt created with the pandemic, together with a commitment by the ECB to buy them on the secondary market and holding them to maturity. Now, this would be consistent with the current Treaty of Lisbon, because the European Central Bank would not purchase the bonds directly on the primary market, but on the secondary market. So, from a strictly legal point of view, this proposal would not be counter to the current clauses of the European treaties. But of course, this fourth strategy would have some implications on monetary policy, the resulting expansionary monetary policy. Similarly, the fifth scenario would be an outright cancellation of part of debt, together with a commitment by the European Central Bank to a progressive replacement of the stock of government bonds over time in its balance sheet. So in this sense, the decision by the ECB would produce a double positive effect on EU member state government debt service by reducing twice the share of debt to GDP held by non-European investors. The sixth proposal would be to increase progressively the stock of member state government bonds, so effectively maintaining the current policies, but expanding its scope. So the policy would still remain voluntary and revocable, but that would correspond to a monetary expansion of this quantitative easing program. The seventh suggestion has been put forward by Stefano Micossi recently, and would involve the European Stability Mechanism, which is an intergovernmental entity, intergovernmental agency. The government debt held by the European Central Bank will be purchased by the European Stability Mechanism using its own capital as collateral. And this operation could be financed with bond issues by the European Stability Mechanism itself. Now, one difficulty with this proposal is that the European Stability Mechanism is an intergovernmental agency, and so this would not would be subject to intergovernmental negotiations. It may not be as easy to implement and enforce as strategies implemented directly by the European Central Bank system. So these are the 7 proposals, and as I mentioned, some of these proposals have already been discussed in public debate and met with a number of reservations. And so one possible reservation concerns the ECB balance sheet. At present, the European GDP amounted to 18.8 trillion euros in 2019. The EU debt generated by the COVID pandemic can be conservatively fixed at about 10%. Now, the ECB balance sheet, consolidated annual balance sheet, has on the asset side 2.87 trillion of euros of EU member states long-term bonds, and 0.6 trillion for repurchase agreement and for the conduct of short-term monetary policy. So this one issues whether the reduction in the stock of bonds held by the European Central Bank would also impair its ability to conduct effective monetary policy. Now, the stock of member government bonds was really created mostly in the last few years through quantitative easing. It was about zero before the year 2000, and now it's amount to about 2.87 trillion euros. Now, on the liability side, the two main items are the 1.2 trillion banknotes and 1.8 trillion bank reserves. Should be noted that the ECB made a net profit in 2019. Actually, profits increased from 1.57 to 2.36 billion euros due to an increase in net interest income and profits from financial operations. Now, how the proposals impact on the profit and loss position of the European Central Bank. Now, the first scenario, basically freezing the current situation, but transforming it from voluntary to perpetual and irrevocable commitment to roll over and return the interest payments, would basically freeze the current profits and losses position of the ECB. The only difference is that from voluntary and temporary, it will become permanent and irrevocable. And similar consequences would be under the second scenario, conversion of long-term bonds into irredeemable bonds yielding zero interest rates. And so under the first two scenarios, any concerns about the ECB balance sheet effects and on its reputation will be minimized. Now, the third scenario, debt write-off or partial cancellation of debt, would create a loss on the European Central Bank assets, but this loss will be compensated by the present value of current and future expected seigniorage revenues. And so the effects of this loss on the euro exchange rates, on the ECB reputation, and also potentially on the role of euro as a reserve currency should be taken into account. Okay, so we should also consider the potential implications of a debt write-off on the investors' holdings of euro-denominated assets in their portfolios. Now, in principle, the European Central Bank can accompany this measure by change in its seigniorage policy by reducing the share of seigniorage paid to sovereign countries. So sovereign countries will thus partially contribute to the cost of the intervention and their benefits will be reduced. Now, alternatively, the ECB could maintain its actual seigniorage policy, thereby not reducing the time needed to cover the loss on its balance sheet. Now, it could be argued that this third approach to debt relief, in principle, could impair the ECB ability to implement anti-inflationary policies by reducing its firepower, as it were, the stock of bonds that can be used, for instance, in open market operations. However, given the amount of government bonds on the ECB asset side, of the remaining government bonds, and also the wide range of instruments at its disposal to conduct monetary policy, the ECB will effectively maintain intact its capacity to counter these inflationary pressures. Now, the fourth scenario could, in principle, have some inflationary consequences and could imply further monetary expansion, and therefore its use should be assessed with some caution. The fourth scenario consists of the EU member states issuing perpetual bonds up to a defined target, and the ECB would voluntarily choose to include them into its pandemic emergency purchase program strategy, which is one of the non-standard, unconventional monetary policy tools enacted by the European Central Bank. The fifth scenario, which combines debt relief with monetary expansion through additional purchase of government bonds, would over time have no overall effect on the asset liability side, because the write-off will be progressively offset by the purchase of new bonds. So there will be no consequences on the asset liability side of the European Central Bank, but again, there could be potential inflationary consequences. So we'll discuss the risks to inflation later on. Now, the sixth scenario, which would be an incremental variation of the current voluntary and revocable policy, would effectively correspond to a monetary expansion, but would result effectively in an increase of the central bank commitment to cope with the problem of COVID-19 government debt. And finally, the seventh scenario, the Micossi suggestion, transferring sovereign bonds purchased by the European Central Bank to the European Stability Mechanism, will effectively roll over sovereign bonds and therefore would make them equivalent to irredeemable bonds. And these securities will be guaranteed by the European Stability Mechanism's own capital and ultimately by the existing member states. But what are the legal aspects of these proposals? I mentioned all the 7 proposals do not violate Article 123 of the Lisbon Treaty, in the sense that do not recommend or do not prescribe the purchase of EU government bonds directly on the primary market by the central bank. Although some doubts could be raised regarding the fourth hypothesis. The EU member states would issue perpetual bonds, and the ECB would voluntarily choose to include them in its non-conventional asset purchasing strategy, pandemic emergency purchasing power strategy. Although the ECB would purchase them on the secondary market and not than the primary market. But sorry, I went too far. Okay, so sorry, I went too far in the presentation. Okay, so from a strictly legal point of view, these proposals would not be in contradiction with the Lisbon Treaty and with the Charter of the European Central Bank. However, a related legal issue is whether this proposal would breach the principle of separation between monetary and fiscal policy, and whether this breach would represent by itself a violation of EU treaties. And in this respect, what we can observe is that the pandemic emergency purchasing power strategy, as it is implemented at present, is already intended to counter the risk of the monetary transmission mechanism, but is already de facto practice helping governments to maintain low interest rates on government bonds. And therefore, it is an explicit help to their fiscal policy. So this separation between monetary and fiscal policy is already much less clear-cut at present. However, at present, the current policy is a temporary program, reversible, whereas our proposals would have a permanent effect on the portion of debt held by the ECB. Okay. Now, an important issue that is also raised with respect to debt cancellation, debt restructuring, is the moral hazard problem, and the nature, the problem arises because a lack of fiscal discipline following debt restructuring or debt relief could, in principle, offset the effects of debt cancellation. And in principle, we can think of 2 forms of moral hazard: an interim moral hazard and an ex post moral hazard. Now, in the interim, the very discussion of the possibility of debt relief before the end of the pandemic could lead EU member countries to increase their deficit in the anticipation that the additional debt would be cancelled. And ex post, a successful episode of debt relief could create the expectation of possible debt cancellations in the future, thereby undermining the ex ante incentives to maintain fiscal discipline. Now, these moral hazard problems, in our view, could be solved by imposing strict conditionality rules, provided these rules are enforceable and credible. And an example is the Next Generation EU program. According to this program, resources are made available for public investment by member countries that are affected by the pandemic. But these resources, this release of resources, is accompanied by rules that block the supply of subsequent tranches if the intermediate project goals are not achieved. And therefore, it's possible in principle to impose strict conditionality rules on the use of resources that are released by debt relief. And it would be important that the ECB and EU institutions are allowed to implement timely and unilateral actions that could be promptly communicated and implemented. So interim moral hazard can be avoided by careful monitoring of the public finances of the member states during the crisis. And ex post moral hazard could be ruled out by the credibility of the ECB stance, but also by the very extraordinary nature of the current pandemic. COVID-19 debt cancellation would be not massive event, but it would be a consequence, or let's say, the result of a unique crisis. And if any form of debt relief is accepted as being a unique decision related to a unique event, then this should not give rise to expectations of future debt cancellations. Furthermore, moral hazard issues could be further reduced if actions of debt relief are not limited to the European central banks, but also if other major central banks undertake similar actions, possibly in a coordinated fashion. And Federal Reserve and the Bank of Japan would be prominent institutions under this respect. Now, I mentioned that inflation could be an issue that should be taken into account when considering various forms of debt relief. And I'd like to leave the floor to Leonardo so that he can take over from here. So I'd like to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Pasquale. I'm trying to share myself. Let me see if it works. Can you see? Yes, I think you can see my window now.
Not yet.
Just a moment. Okay, now you see my window, and I'll put my slide. Okay, you see them?
Yes, excellent.
Yes.
Okay. So basically, I want to start with this famous porcupine graph. Why? Because in the last years, the institutions have systematically failed their inflation forecast. First of all, the ECB, but also the other forecasting institutions. Their forecasts were all upward biased. So it seems that they miss a sort of factors that keep inflation low. Why this is important? Because, of course, central banks, we tend to think that they are almost almighty, but they have a limit to their power. Always that they can create inflation by increasing money supply. And of course, inflation is a problem for the purchasing power and for the value of money itself. So what we should worry about in our proposal of debt relief is whether they can trigger inflation or if they can reduce the capacity of the central bank to fight inflation in case inflation restarts. But what going in this part of the presentation is that basically what's happening with globalization is a sort of globalization is giving us a cost, which is the cost of creating a downward pressure in labor cost. But it's also giving us a dividend, and the dividend is that inflation is more under control than in other periods of our history. Why I believe that this structural factor creating a deflationary scenario are at work in this moment, because before the globalization, the power of labor unions were very strong. The option of delocalization was not much less available. So their bargaining power over wages was very good, and when there were excess money, it was easier for them to translate this into wage increase and then price increase. And also the pace of innovation was lower. Globalization has increased the velocity of circulation of the of knowledge, of diffusion of knowledge. So what we say is that today we have a lot of technological advancement. We had the web revolution. The web revolution is important not just because for the circulation of knowledge, but also because we can decompose the value chain. And I see it done. It is possible to go on the web, to create a product, to take contact with someone who makes the marketing for you, who produces your product somewhere, and to do it everything. So you create your own value chain at the lowest possible cost, of course. So in some sense, with globalization, we also have competition among government states. And this is what I call the race to the bottom, because regional institutions are engaged in a sort of Bertrand competition. Basically, they tend to offer the lowest possible cost conditions in terms of labor, in terms of environmental rules, in terms of fiscal of taxes. So basically, the risk is that we end up into an equilibrium of nations without wealth and therefore without resources needed to pay public goods, and wealth without nations. This is the cost of. But of course, this is an advantage. The advantage is that it keeps inflation very low. So first, for the same two reasons I said above. First, for the technological innovation, which keep the price low, and second, for the erosion of the bargaining power of workers. But let's focus a little bit more on technological innovation. I am sure that the inflation rates that we measure are upward biased. Why? Because they they fail to keep into account properly the quality improvements that our products incorporate. Let's take the example of our cell phone. We sleep, and while we sleep, our cell phone make automatic updating. This updating increase their quality, give us other functions, and we do this without paying anything more than what we paid when we cell phone. Again, with the web revolution, a lot of weightless goods like sounds, data, images and services, imagine the tutorial, are for free on the web, while before we had to pay them. I don't think that these things are incorporated to the properly into the baskets that we use to create inflation. So basically, all this fact of the like stronger pace of innovation, increasing skill wage differential, declining labor share, and deflationary pressure creates the condition for more room for expansionary monetary policy. And the incapacity of using this room in the past has been in part responsible for the increase of government debt. As we know, the fact that, for example, the European Central Bank missed the target of 2%, has increased the real value of debt. And we calculate, for example, for Italy, that it is caused like at least in the last 10 years, 10-15 points of the debt GDP share. So the debt GDP share would have been 10-15 points lower if the European Central Bank had achieved his target of 2%. inflation. So basically, what we say again, that we need to use price indexes, dynamic price indexes that to keep into account this. But of course, what is interesting for us today here is that there is room for this more expansionary monetary policy, implied in part by the debt relief, only in part, because many of our 7 solutions do not create inflation. But also what we want to say is that the central bank does not lose its power of using ammunitions and means and measures to fight inflation in case inflation will restart. Why this? Because of course we say that part of the government bonds in their balance sheet will be cancelled in case of some of our rules. But of course, the central bank maintain all the short-term government bonds and a lot of long-term government bonds to do open market operations, and they can issue new bonds, of course. So that's basically our argument for about inflation. Let us, of course, the money must go somewhere. This is also part of the debate, no? And we know where it can go. It can go to create financial inflation, so to inflate the value of asset prices, and to create financial bubble. And when this happens, of course, you may have a deviation between the observed and fundamental price of the assets, and this may create financial crisis when the bubble bursts. But also, we know that all these financial crises, in the end, they create a destruction of supply, and they can solve by an increase in money supply. Of course, this has a lot of distributive effects, and we have to take this into account. Again, we say in these slides that part of our proposal are not inflationary. Example, those from 1 to 3. Of course, another destination of the liquidity is as reserves in the central bank balance, and this is what's happened mainly in this period, because on the one side the central bank gives more money, on the other side he makes strict regulation for giving loans to the bank, and of course this is also an instrument of the monetary policy, and of course this contributes to reduce the capacity of this extra money to go for the financing of the real economy. So the central bank has for maneuver in terms of regulation. We don't think that there is a problem of ECB independence in our suggestions, because of course the central bank has to decide independently about this debt relief proposal, not because it is forced by the national governments, and it can be a one-for-all decision. And another issue that is is raised usually is that could end up having a negative net assets, and this is not a particular problem, because the central bank balance sheet is really a peculiar one. Paris and Byblos, when they discussed the Padre plan, they consider this point, and basically they think that this is not a big problem. First of all, because the central bank cannot default. The only risk of default of the central bank, the only risk for central bank is inflation on exchange rate, not default on its balance sheet. And so this is an accounting convention. Also because what Paris and Byblos proposed for the Padre plan, which was a much stronger impact on the balance sheet, because all the debt in excess of 60%, the GDP ratio had to be transformed into redeemable bonds. In that case, they considered that it could be possible to put it in balance sheet of the seigniorage revenues of the central banks. And Becchetti and Chernoz calculate that for the US, this value is equal to 30% of GDP. Of course, this could be calculated everywhere. The other issue, if you look better to the central bank balance sheet, we also realize that there is something peculiar. For example, why currency is registered on the liability side? Of course, in the past, standard, liquidity holdings corresponded to a claim toward the central bank. You can get gold for that. And of course, that was said. Then it made sense that it was a liability for the central bank. Why? Because a liability is such only when it implies a costly obligation on behalf of the debtor. You have to give back something or pay an interest. But now it is not the case, because the holder of the currency issued by the central is not entitled to any claim. So there is a discussion in the literature about that, why we shouldn't change this idea. And for example, an idea from Kumhoff et al. In 2020 is that central bank money should be considered as social equity more than a liability. Why? Because it gives the right of participation in the economy payment system, and this is the main reason. As well, in many central statutes, we can find that the possibility of having negative equity for certain periods, it's allowed. This is an example, is the Bank of Israel. Consider as well that this is again an accounting convention, because in the case of the transformation into irredeemable bonds, if we calculate the value of these bonds at the nominal value, we don't have negative equity. Of course, if we calculate them at the market value, the on the balance sheet applies, and the negative equity problem that can be progressively solved with seigniorage revenues can come out. Again, what is very important to say, and we say in our paper, is that the independence of the central bank is not undermined. This is an unilateral decision of the central bank, and it's in some sense something that can help the independence of the central bank, because we can bank independence into goal independence and instrument independence. The goal independence remains, which is again consistent with this goal of transmission of monetary policy across different member states. And on the other side, what we envision with our 7 proposal is giving new instruments to the central bank, which can be useful to achieve goal depending on the circumstances that we are living and the extraordinary circumstances that we are living today. So, and the central bank, of course, in the recent periods are demonstrated to be independent also in terms of instruments, because it has devised new instruments to tackle the financial crisis and the new times. So we mean that more precisely, proposing is not a violation of the central bank independence and not a violation of central bank mandate. Actually, this could be the best strategy to pursue its statutory goal, which is the transmission of monetary policy through instruments independence, which has to be enriched by new options that can be relevant given the situation that we are living and the pandemic shocks. So to conclude with, I would say that a lot of discussion in the literature of where macroeconomics will go after this financial crisis. We are walking into an unknown land, and we are learning also things during this crisis. We are learning about the effects of more aggressive monetary policy in these times, and this is why probably also Blanchard, Krugman, and Summers are calling for a paradigm shift. They are discussing this paradigm shift of the policy. For example, there is a very important point made by Summers that we have a situation in which we have moved from a situation of lower GDP ratio but higher interest rate payments to GDP. Italy, for example, was 105 debt GDP ratio in year 2000 and 6.2 interest GDP ratio, to a situation in which paradoxically we have a higher debt GDP ratio. It jumped from 100 to 150, and the lower interest payment over GDP, almost half, due to the extraordinary non-conventional monetary policies of the central banks. This should lead us to say that what we discuss is not important because debt sustainability is not an issue today. We think no, because of course we are living a situation of very low real interest interest rates, very low interest rates, thanks to the non-conventional policies of the central bank. But on the same time, we know that there is an upside interest rate risk. So having a huge government debt not only distorts the incentive of the private sector and creates crowding out, as well said by Pasquale when he mentioned the paper in the literature of Krugman and others. So create a risk, because in case of interest rates upside, of course, the situation changes. That is what happened, for example, at the time of the Latin American debt crisis. So the room of maneuver, it's important. It has to be exploited. And we say in our conclusion also that this is a situation where an agreement between central bank, cooperation between central bank, for example, to face potential exchange rate problems when taking this decision, even though some central banks are doing by themselves these extraordinary policies without cooperation. So basically, we think that this form of debt cancellation can have an advantage, and of course we must not miss the point of what is the advantage of doing this, is that of reducing risk for the future, of increasing incentive for the private sector, reducing crowding out, and of creating situation and condition for better investment and growth and well-being conditions for the next generation and for our generation for the future. Thank you.
Victor, you are muted. Yeah.
Thank you so much, both Pasquale and Leonardo, for a very interesting presentation, thought-provoking, absolutely detailed. Very good. And congratulations on this piece of work that has implications for what's happening, especially for governments and central banks. Okay, so we are now to this stage where we go to the audience to get comments, suggestions, and some feedback. There are some comments in the chat, but let me see if you'd like to make a comment. Please indicate by show of hands. By show, just indicate, click on the raise the hand. So that I can see a signal. Okay, so we have yes, from Oli Levy. Oli, please go ahead.
Yes, hi. Thank you for the interesting presentation. My question is about the implications of the various scenarios that you have presented for inequality, both within countries and between countries. You kind of briefly mentioned the globalization putting pressure on wages as a good thing. So I was wondering if how would you see the implication of the various plans that you have presented? Thank you.
Thank you, Oli. Okay, who wants to go? Either both or
Leonardo, would you like to respond?
Yes, I can say something. Of course, there are a lot of distribution implications. First of all, there is an implication in terms of distribution effects among, in the case this is done by Europe, the European Central Bank, of course, there is a problem among member states. If, for example, between Euro member states and non-Euro member states, because of course this is going to affect Euro countries. Of course, as we said with Pasquale, there is an effect on holders of private holders of government bonds, because the effect of the debt relief changes the risk profile of course, the government bonds, and it can have consequences on price and interest rates. So this is something that can be considered. But I think that in the end, the effects are determined by the destination of the money, of the extra money that is created, or the room that is created for fiscal policies, for expansionary fiscal policies. Because we must not forget that what I call the race to the bottom has created a strong distribution effect between low-skilled and high-skilled, and low-skilled. So if what we are advocating is done to create, for example, education program for the low-skilled or whatever, it can be seen as a sort of compensation for the distributive concerns and problem created by globalization itself. Of course, this depends on the plan that you envisage for the use of the extra room for monetary and fiscal policy.
Thank you, Leonardo. I don't know whether you want to add to that, Pasquale.
Yes, no, I agree with Leonardo, and thank you, Orly, for your question. I mean, you mentioned that we said that wealth compression has positive implications. I don't think this is what we meant. It tends to reduce inflationary pressures, but of course, that could have some very negative effect on on income and welfare of large sections of the labor market. And in Western countries, we have seen in recent decades a phenomenon known as polarization. So a sharp increase in incomes and wealth between the richest and the lowest segments of the labor market. So in our view, the resources released by these debt relief programs could be used precisely to address some of these inequalities. We have seen that recent experiences of austerity programs tend to have a disproportionate consequence on the low income segments of the labor market. So putting in place measures to reduce the need to follow austerity policies would directly, we believe, in principle, allow resources to reduce these within country inequalities and inequalities within the labor market, and reduce some of the most extreme and damaging effects of polarization in labor markets.
Yes, Pasquale. Also, what we said is that the downward pressure on wages is the cost of globalization, but that globalization has also a dividend. The dividend is that there is less inflationary pressure, and we are not exploiting this dividend. That's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, thank you very much, both Leonardo and Pasquale. I think one of the if I just looking at the notes in the chat room, in the global view, COVID-19 is a global shock, and I think the scenarios you have explained with respect to ECB, most countries, almost every country in the world would be facing this, problem where they have had to take on extraordinary funding of unanticipated programs, and trying to shore both the private sector and as well as government sectors. So this being such a global shock in terms of flow of funds, it's different. I think it's the first time ever this happens as a global shock, whereby all countries freeze, maybe even greater than the First World War and Second World War. So if you do know, in terms of flow of funds, then where is the market? Where the market for the, and this is one of the questions I can see on the chat, where is the market for being to purchase these bonds? You would anticipate, because yes, I suppose that all countries would be facing the same scenarios you have charted for ECB. If this was a European shock, then of course the other countries in the world, and in the Second World War, the US would be able to step in and buy the debt. Yeah, I don't know whether you have any comment on this.
My point on that, and then I'll see Pasquale what he thinks about. But my point is that the clue, for example, European Union issued the bonds for first EU bonds for the SURE program, the program of refinancing unemployment insurance. The demand was 13 times the supply. So it doesn't seem that, I think that the enormous amount of money that has been poured into the system by the central banks has not reduced the global wealth. Of course, the global wealth is very badly distributed, but is not lower. And but of course, this has to be evaluated at the global level. But on our point of view in the European Union, and the private wealth has not fallen in this period.
Okay, thank you. Pasquale, do you have any observations to make here?
Yes, I mean, as you said, Victor, this is a global shock that does not just affect European countries or the European Union, but most countries in the world. And in our paper, we only looked at strategies that could be implemented within the European Union. But of course, it would be important to consider if something can be done at a global level involving international agencies and organizations such as the IMF and the World Bank. We do state that the coordinated action by the main central banks can help reduce, for instance, some of the moral hazard issues. But yes, we don't go explicitly into what could be done at the global level. But this is certainly an important, important point.
We can leave that to the International Monetary Fund. The IMF would be trying to look into these issues and say whether the private sector is buoyant enough to absorb all the global bonds that would be floated in the same market. But I guess central banks will adopt different strategies. Let me see by show of hands any comments or questions or feedback. Am I missing? No. Okay. I don't see. Yeah, Richard.
Yeah, I was interested by your comment towards the end of your presentation that it would be, I think you said it would be morally indefensible to ask future generations to pay debts incurred by the present generation. And of course, that was pretty much word for word the justification that was given for austerity policies following the global financial crisis of, I mean, you said 2007 to 8, some would say 9 or 10. But of course, in the past, major emergencies, and I think we're all agreed that the COVID-19 pandemic is a major emergency, have given rise to long-term government debt. The example that came to mind was that the UK's debt to the United States that came from World War II, famously, it was announced as finally paid off under Tony Blair in the early 2000s. So given the size of the COVID-19 emergency, is it reasonable to say, well, these debts were accrued in the current generation, they need to be paid off, they need to be paid off within the space of a single generation, or given the problems of polarization and austerity that Pasquale was talking about, do we have to accept, okay, this debt is huge and it's going to take a long time to pay it off?
This is a very important perspective from where we should see this problem, because what a colleague of mine made me realize that the conflicts between, of course, we reason in terms of intergenerational solidarity and these things, but if we look at the thing in the perspective of conflict between generation, the sacrifice we ask to the young, a strong sacrifice, in some cases irrecoverable sacrifice. I think of my adolescent daughter who couldn't go at the age of 16 or 17. These times will never go back in terms of social life. You can catch up education, but okay, and we hope okay. But we asked a very strong sacrifice to defend, mainly to defend the lives of the elders, because that's what the COVID effect. So in some sense, the imbalance across generation has been strong also from this point of view. So I think that in addition to the traditional consideration of the debt creates, of course, a burden on those who are going to pay if they are not, it's not going to be paid by the same generation. This is this additional question, in my opinion, that adds to this imbalance between generations.
Yes, I fully agree with you. And if I also follow on that, if we take a forward-looking perspective, say permanent income perspective, the COVID crisis has permanently reduced the permanent income of current and future generations. So we had to find a balanced way to spread the burden. And it's the current young people are suffering disproportionately from the crisis. Their schooling, their education is affected, their job prospects are affected. Students are graduated last year, who are about to graduate this year, will find much more difficult conditions in the labor market. And so, yes, from the point of view of intergenerational equity, it would be important to make sure that they do not they're not burdened excessively with with repayment of debt from the current crisis. Okay.
Both Leonardo and Pasquale on those very important intergenerational cohort questions. The hand is up for Meng. I have a question.
Yes, I have one question, which is influenced by what I've observed recently in the financial market, and it's the the huge increase of interest in cryptocurrency investment. Mm-hmm. And I wonder how this will affect any debt relief policy or plans, because years ago, when we had a financial crisis, the cryptocurrency market was not so influential. And so this year, we have seen a lot of institutional investors. They have given up investment in traditional goods and products, and they reallocate funds into cryptocurrencies or cryptocurrency products, and how this will affect any debt relief policy. I just wonder.
Thanks, Meng. And of course, that has implications also for Signorage, which has been featured as an important aspect of our revenue for the debt. So, over to you, Leonardo and Pasquale. Thanks, Meng.
Thank you.
We did not consider, of course, this in our paper, but what I may say just at first glance is that, yes, cryptocurrency can be a threat to seniorage. And of course, in our paper, we said that seniorage revenues are required to pay over time the unbalance in the balance sheet, even though we may consider even without considering a change in the policy. On the other side, I think that cryptocurrency, I don't think now they are so developed, but if they are more, when they are more developed, they can create additional liquidity, and it's even more extraordinary that this even with this additional liquidity that we are not going to consider usually, prices remain so low. So even more the issue about the structural change applies if we take also into account the extra liquidity created by local currencies or cryptocurrency.
Thank you. You add, Pasquale?
No, I have nothing to add.
Okay,
No,
okay. Thank you. Thanks very much. Okay, okay. Any further comments by show of hands, or just unmute and ask a question? Aisha Demir.
Hi, actually, I'm sorry I missed the first part of the presentation because I had many other meetings with Coventry University, but I really don't want to miss at least the question and answer part of this seminar. Thank you very much, Becchetti and Pasquale, for this great presentation. Actually, my question is an overall question which I have been wondering since the beginning of the COVID and all these lockdowns and government debt issues. To what extent the government debt, because I have been reading some articles on government debt, for many articles suggest that this will not be a problem for many governments. There are many ways which they can resolve the government debt issues, but to what extent implementing these policies are sustainable in the long term? And because without production, because many people, many countries are now implementing lockdown rules, restrictions, which prevent people to engage in production activities, to what extent suspending or finding ways to resolve these government debt issues sustainable in the long term? And when it comes to UN development goals, which I'm sure they will orient these goals again based on the pandemic, to what extent these two align to each other? What do you think about that? Because all these government debts and they have inflationary pressure, and there is no production, and in the meantime it will be a problem on the both demand side and supply side. So we will see the reflections, at least in the medium term. So what do you think about that? Thank you.
Thank you, Aisha.
What I see from my perspective is that this is a temporary situation, we hope, in the sense that if the vaccine will work, and I hope will work in the UK as in Italy, what we experience this summer when the will be better is a V recovery. The recovery was very strong this summer, and of course then it was halted by the second wave. But I'm quite confident that as soon as we finish this pandemic, there will be a very strong willing motivation and desire to recover, and this will push a recovery. So what we are saying is that it would be good that in order to give a good restart, of course, in perspective of sustainability and all things that we know of sustainable development goals, we should remove this burden, this extra burden that has been created and that could otherwise distort incentive of the private sector that are very important for the recovery.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes. Leonardo. Yeah. Yes, Pasquale.
Yes, if I may follow on that, the pandemic has created aggregate problems, but also sector-specific problems. So from the point of view of the economy as a whole, or the aggregate economy, it's clear that government had to intervene, to put in place measures of fiscal policy to sustain incomes during the heavy lockdown. And of course, these measures cannot be maintained indefinitely because they also result in whole sectors of the economy being frozen. So from a sort of short-term, medium-term point of view, it was necessary to put in place broad macro policies. But of course, the pandemic itself will create some will induce some structural changes among these sectors of the economy. Some sectors will hopefully fully recover, but possibly some other sectors will have to be will suffer a permanent reduction in their size. There will be well, the way we work, presumably there will be an increased possibility to work from a distance, smart working, teleworking. I think we will return to our offices, hopefully. I look forward to returning to my office at SOAS as soon as possible. But shortly, there will also be increased possibility of working from a distance, and that has implications, for instance, for not for economic activities in the cities. Will the centre of London still remain so dense with all sorts of services that are currently offered to commuting workers? And these issues will have to be addressed. But precisely for that reason, I think it's important to make sure that the governments have the sufficient firepower to deal with these issues and utilize resources to help sectors in crisis. So reducing that burden could release resources that could then be used partly also to redress these sectoral imbalances that may become permanent after the pandemic.
Thank you, David. Thank you.
Thank you both. Oli, do you want to come in again? I can see your hand up.
If there is no one else who wants to step in.
I haven't seen a hand, so please go ahead. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, what is your view on because you mentioned the distribution of the wealth that is going to create, but distribution is essentially a political process. And what is your view on the ability of the political systems to actually distribute it in a more equitable way? I know I'm asking economists about political processes,
no,
but this is it's highly interconnected when it comes to who gets what.
Yes. With Pasquale, we have also written paper about what we call the vote with the wallet. So our idea is that in order to counteract this race to the bottom, you first, you can activate citizenship. Of course, people choose sustainable products or whatever. But what is very important, I think, it's the creation of border taxes, because in my perspective, it is impossible in the globalized competition to set high standards in one country. Let's say, for example, high environmental standards, high labor standards, if you allow social and environmental dumping. Because if you set high standards, you have the paradox of triggering delocalization. I make you the example of European Union environmental standards. They are very high. And what is the fare? The fare is carbon leakage. What is carbon leakage? Companies go to produce elsewhere where they don't have to pay carbon taxes or green certificates. And the effects on pollution is the same, because basically it's a global public bad, a public emission. So if the United Kingdom or whatever, they want to defend their welfare, their civilization, they have to put border carbon taxes What does it mean? It means that when a product comes from abroad, you evaluate whether it is below those standards, and if it is below those standards, it pays an extra value-added tax. And it's impressive that this is in the program of European Union 23, and this is has been the highest level of consensus in the United States. If you go, you find that 2,500 economists and 24 Nobel laureates have signed the declaration asking for a carbon tax and a border carbon tax. So I think that the time are mature for doing that, because this means a revolution of international trade. International trade does not race to the bottom for a search for the lowest price, and is not a fight between countries with tariffs or whatever. It is a competition fair based also on the quality, social and environmental quality of the products. And the only way to do this is with border taxes. I think this is the main challenge. Of course, then you have a lot of resources for national progressive taxation. So we can talk about the national policies for redistribution, and in any country we have minimum wage or whatever. But I think that the international problem comes before. If we don't solve the international problem, we cannot escape the race to the bottom, because basically countries compete to attract companies, offering them the opportunity of paying the lowest in terms of labor, in terms of taxation. No, I think if we don't solve this problem, and I think that the economy is now aware about that. That's my.
Thank you. Do you have anything to add, Pasquale, on this?
Well, I not fully agree with Leonardo, and I mean, maybe the point of view of the also Brexit Britain, this could pose a particular challenge given the way the policy debate seems to be going at present. But I don't really want to go into that. But just to say that I think that Leonardo's proposal would be highly valuable.
Thank you. I see another hand again from Richard. Is that another hand, or you want to come in again?
No, it's a new hand. Okay. I just wanted to comment that I thought that Leonardo's suggestion of a carbon border tax is highly sensible. I think the argument that he made, I entirely agree with. And Pasquale may have been understandably coy about drawing parallels with Brexit Britain. As a British citizen, I will be less coy. I think the European Union was well publicized. One of the major issues in the trade agreement was the so-called level playing field. And as somebody who is both a British citizen and a Europhile, I was very firmly on the EU side on that one. I thought, absolutely. Now, what Leonardo's been talking about is, on the one hand, a border tax designed to address a global problem, climate change, global environmental degradation, but it's also about the level playing field. The whole point that if the European Union imposes strict environmental standards, it's an invitation to businesses to locate their production in Indonesia or Brazil or wherever. And I think the fact that the issue of level playing field was put right front and center in terms of the Brexit negotiations provides a useful precedent. We say, yeah, this is another example of the level playing field. We're not protective. We're not trying to ring fence our economy for the sake of it. But if you break the environmental standards that we think are appropriate for the entire planet and produce goods more cheaply as a result, then there will be, and we can call it a border tax, it's a tariff. Of course it's a tariff. There will be a tariff that you pay for that.
Yes.
Thanks, Richard.
Thanks.
And a response, or as a comment, I guess, rather than a question. Comment on a comment.
No, it was in line, and I just add that there is a great chance now for a European Union US club, as it was said by Brugger, and maybe UK as well, because the new election, the new president, and the document signed by the US economist says that can be an agreement between the most important areas of the world. And if this is the case, I think it's easier to implement. And of course, the issue is that to be consistent with the trade rule, this has to be applied to ourselves as well. That's what will ask to us. They say, okay, if you apply these standards, of course, products that are done in your area, they must keep those standards. Otherwise, they should be subject to the same tax. So that's what I to enforce that.
Thank you indeed. Yeah, good. And see, Christine. Hello. Just unmute, please. I think there is a question.
Yeah, thank you, Leonardo and Pasquale, for your paper, which is really stimulating and important, I think. I just wanted to follow up on some of the points Ollie's raised about distribution, because, and I know it's slightly tangential to what you've said, although you've touched on it, but so perhaps it's something for further research rather than your paper. One of the issues on distribution is not so much with sectors that are exposed to international competition. It's actually a lot to do with people working in the health system and working in retail distribution, where there's very limited international competition. And yet these people who have kept us going through the crisis and saved many lives are earning very low incomes. And in some sense, we all kind of owe a debt to them, because now they're working extremely long hours and we are burying them as well. They're exposed to extreme risk, both in supermarkets and in hospitals. So I just wonder whether more could be done on redistribution across income groups, which would stimulate demand, because the propensity to consume is higher across low income groups. And there seems to be some more political appetite. I understand the political objections to redistribution, that it's very hard to get elected saying going to tax the rich. But it does seem, against a background of really rising inequality in terms of wealth and income, that if some opportunity is not taken now to put forward a case for redistribution of income and wealth, I just wonder when we could ever make it. And it's interesting to read Keynes's How to Pay for the War on that, because he was quite clear that that it would be the rich that would have to pay for deferred consumption in the form of buying the bonds and so on, and that a greater burden would have to fall on those that were more wealthy in terms of wealth and income, in terms of progressive taxation and redistribution. And he set that whole procedure for that. So I just wonder whether, to push you on that a little bit and think, can you think of something more redistributive rather than focusing just on the international competition as a constraint?
You are muted, Leonardo.
I think this is, first of all, a cultural problem, because I was really impressed by a paper of Bonica on Journal Economic Perspective, when he wrote why inequality hasn't slowed down with democracy. So the question, that's a very good research question. He says, why, if let's say 90% of people are paying this higher inequality, why they are voting for parties which creates non-progressive or increase inequality? So I think there is a cultural issue. We have to wonder about that. Of course, it has to do with lobbying, with the communication power in electoral campaign or whatever, no? But this is part of the problem to me. About so I don't think it's a problem of that we don't know what should be done to reduce inequality. Of course, we know as economists. The issue is what is politically no, given the consensus and the way people think today. Of course, I can say that in Italy, for example, we introduced something like citizenship income, which of course is controversial because there are some negative incentive for work, but it has been introduced. Or we have, for example, tax credit that can be so it is good also for those who are tax exempt for house restructuring. So we have several. I think that you can put progressivity in any decision, no? Also in a reform of income taxation. But I think that the real question that we should make is why redistribution is not politically sexy.
Thank you very much. Just maybe I don't see any other hands up, but maybe just for concluding this, just a way, maybe if you can give some what you would call parting shots, takeaways that people can carry away from your great paper. Maybe in terms of you gave us very interesting technically and economically feasible ways. You indicated debt freezing. You went into debt restructuring, and I liked your perpetual bond because it's consistent with the bond valuation models, whereby time tends to infinity, the value of the debt is zero, and it's whether you can grow greater than the interest rate. So that's feasible. And then you have also, you consider outright debt cancellation. Which would you like to, just on the basis of the information you have, which would you like to put on the fore and say, okay, this should be given some serious thought? Just in a pecking order type of, yeah.
Okay. I asked to Pasquale.
Yeah.
I'll say something.
Well, I think possibly my preference would be for the outright write-off of a given portion of that, what we call the third proposal, because it would be the clearest, the neatest one, and would permanently release resources for fiscal policy to address all the important issues that have been raised, including redistribution, support for those categories of workers who have been overwhelmingly affected by the crisis. And Christine mentioned workers in the health sectors, but women have suffered disproportionately from the pandemic, the changed labor market conditions in the pandemic, or workers in temporary jobs in the gig economy. And and I think that an outright debt cancellation by the ECB that would permanently release resources. And there is an issue whether it is politically feasible, and of course this is a big issue. We know that even within the European Union there is the difference. It's a group of countries, so-called frugal countries, that tend to be opposed to any form of redistribution, although even they had to change their stance given the severity of the crisis, and accept some forms of sharing of debt and common fiscal policy. So yes, I think my preference would go for
I add to what Pasquale says three things. First is that I also think that I'm very curious for the debt write-off. think it would be a great experiment, and we could discover that we are freer than we believe. So I think it would be great to see that probably there are not such terrible consequences of that. It can be done. And also, I would say that one of our 7 proposals, that the mildest one, is what actually the European Central Bank is doing, to increase non-conventional policy. And also, this is Pasquale knows, and maybe I can share. We were contacted by a group of international economists in Europe that prepared a document asking for one of our proposals, which is irredeemable bond, zero interest rates. The transformation of ECB government bonds held by the ECB. And this is a proposal which is now, for which they are looking for signature, and I can I can send. So that's what's going on.
Oh, thank you so much. I think this is a very good point to conclude this meeting. We are, of course, we know that each one of these scenarios has got its, costs and benefits, and but what we wanted is just a good steer into what your insight is, and that's absolutely helpful. But once again, great paper, great discussion, and let me thank all of you who have been able to make it to this seminar today, and look forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And bye bye.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Victor. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Bye.
you to everyone.